Hello, and welcome to the Personality Junkie Podcast. I'm AJ Drenth.
And I'm Elaine Shallock.
We first wanted to start off by saying that we're really appreciative for all of our listeners who tuned into the first podcast. I believe we had over 1,000 downloads in the first week, and the feedback was generally positive. One piece of constructive feedback that we got was in our pronunciation of Carl Jung's name, and we sort of took more of an American spin on it and pronounced it Jung rather than Jung, and the difference is slight, but there is a difference. I was familiar with that pronunciation of his name. It's just I've historically had an issue with sounding a little too pretentious or a little snobby about pronunciations of things like that. But we're going to try to kind of modify it a little bit as we go on here. So bear with us. Sometimes we'll probably say Jung, other times we'll say Jung, but hopefully you'll know who we're referring to either way. It kind of speaks to a more general issue, though, which is the degree to which our podcast should be a little more informal versus formal. I think in the first podcast, we erred a little bit on the side of formal, maybe sounding a little bit academic at times, but that is who we are. We do value being precise and outlining the correct structure of things. However, we also want to be sensitive to what you guys want to hear and the types of podcasts that you're interested in listening to. And so, we're going to kind of weigh things as we proceed here and figure out how much we want our podcast to be conversational and informal versus, a little bit more academic in tone at times as well. But we definitely want to hear your feedback so that we can make it the best podcast that we can as we go forward. Elaine, do you have anything that you want to say about that?
Well, I absolutely agree with all of that, and this podcast is for you guys, the listeners, and so we really appreciate your input and comments so that we can construct the podcasts around what you want to hear, and so going forward, I do think that we'll maybe aim to talk more personally about ourselves and our experiences. Like me, Elaine, as an INFJ, I might be able to talk more personally with you guys about my experiences in INFJ. AJ as well, being an INTP. But we feel like there's so much ground to cover. We just got through that first podcast, and this is new territory for us because both AJ and I are introverts, as I'm sure you know, and so, we're used to holding up in our, solitude and constructing posts and carefully crafting posts, so we're much more comfortable with the written word than we are, speaking verbally. And so I'm sure that as we go along, we'll feel more comfortable doing the podcasts and being more conversational in tone. So we appreciate your, patience with us. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can chime in, I mean, Elaine and I talk about typology and type-related things all the time, but we've done so informally. So it's mainly just becoming more comfortable with the sort of public interface here. But the conversations are come very naturally. So it's just sort of finding our groove as we move forward. But kind of piggybacking on what Elaine was saying about us being introverts, the natural or the easiest way of us to communicate historically has been through writing, and for that of an extrovert, I think extroverts will often kind of gravitate more naturally towards speaking as their first mode of communication. And so that kind of leads us into what we were going to talk about today, which is the difference between introverts and extroverts and some of the important dynamics that exist between those two broad groups of types, and as well as maybe touch on the ways that introverts and extroverts can grow and develop in their type. introversion and extroversion are two of the more interesting elements of the human personality. Academic research has shown, for instance, that upwards of 60% of the variance of personality can be attributed to these two domains, which basically means that a lot of human personality can be captured and described in terms of introversion and extroversion. And another interesting thing that comes out of research is that these happen to be the two domains that are most easily identifiable visually, even.
And I think the most accepted popularly. A lot of people accept that introversion and extroversion are existent personality traits. They are much more reluctant, I think, to admit to some of the other traits like intuition versus sensing and so on.
Or judging or perceiving.
Right. Introversion and extroversion are pretty commonly accepted.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen an explosion of the term. If you look at Google data, for instance, now I'm really showing my INTP colors here. If you look at Google data, you'll see, as far as the trends of certain words, you'll see that like the term introvert and extrovert have just exploded over the last 10 years or so, and so you see websites popping up all over the place. But anyway, yeah, the academic research has even shown that, there are facial differences. I talk about this in one of my posts called Face Thyself. You can look it up on the Personality Junkie. But it just talks about how we were sort of hardwired to be able to recognize these core differences in people. We can even see it in the facial expressions or the facial structures, as well as in body types. Research has shown that, for instance, introverts tend to have a more ectomorphic body type, which means kind of longer and lankier, thinner at times than extroverts. So there are a lot of visual cues that sort of clue us in to the EI dimension, not to mention gesturing and just physical posturing. There's a lot that can be drawn just from observation of how these different types hold themselves. The introvert will often present with a more closed posturing, maybe arms crossed, legs crossed, almost as though they're caving into themselves or kind of retreating into themselves just through their body posturing, or the levels of eye contact that introverts may withhold compared to extroverts. So there's just a lot of interesting visual cues that we can survey as far as identifying these two types.
Right. I mean, there are, but maybe setting aside for a moment the visual cues, which are important. Ultimately what this comes down to, introversion and extroversion, is a question of the attitude or the energy, how it flows, or the direction that it flows. And while some of that is obviously, like you said, visual, something that we can see and experience visually in these bodily, cues, there are differences depending on, again, as we talked about in that first podcast, what the introversion or extroverted function pairing is.
Right. So, and this derives from Jung's work, in which he said that, the introvert's attention and energy is focused inwardly, whereas the extrovert's is directed outwardly.
So that energy directed either inward or outward results in sort of a funneling system. If you're an introvert, that energy funneled inward creates a more intensive disposition. And then if you're an extrovert, the funneling is sort of the opposite way, going outward, creating an extensive focus. And so one of the key differences then that Jung describes regarding introverts and extroverts is the preference of introverts to focus more intensively on, a given career or project or relationship, versus, the extrovert's propensity maybe to try a multitude of various things, or just to be more extensive or broad in their approach, and maybe give their attention to multiple projects instead of just one at a time.
Right. So extroverts might be better multitaskers or something like that, but I think it's been documented, that extroverts will often maybe have more children, introverts will have fewer children. Extroverts, may prefer to juggle a variety of tasks. Introverts want to get in there and focus on maybe a single project for a longer period of time. Introverts are sometimes said to develop later in life, but it's not that they're developing later. It's there's more preparation. There's more maybe more forethought, more intensive concentration on one thing, and it takes a while for them to gradually build up their expertise in whatever that one thing is, and it finally flowers later in life, whereas the extrovert is often more willing to put him or herself out there earlier in life, sort of fake it till you make it, and just jump in headlong from the get-go. And so,
but ultimately, I think for them, that in that process of trying a breadth of lots of things, a pattern begins to develop, and they begin to find maybe where their skills and their passions kind of repeatedly overlap, and then that in time gives them that sort of inner reflection, maybe that introverts have on the front end, but down the road, extroverts begin to find a consistency and a pattern of some kind of valuing of something, or a pattern of consistency and stability that way, and knowing who they are on the inside as much as they do, in the outer world as well.
Right, and that's a good point. The introvert will be a little bit sheltered from the outer world to start with. They may not be well known or even recognized, but once that, for instance, first scientific discovery is made, then suddenly they're on the scene, but that may not happen until they're in their 40s or 50s. Mm-hmm. So this is what's very interesting about typology, I think, is you have this sort of opposite pattern for these different types, but at the end of life, what you expect to see is them maybe looking a little more similar, because the extrovert, in trying all these things, has maybe eventually stumbled on to more of a singular path. The mm-hmm. introvert, in all of this inner work, eventually starts maybe broadening out a little bit more into external affairs. Maybe after developing their theory, they're more active in the world and how that might be applied, mm-hmm. or go into a classroom and teach the things they've learned over the first half of their lives.
This is also a good place, I think, to point out that extroversions get a reputation for maybe being more self-confident and bold and assertive in what they do, that there's a lot less reticence and shyness that way. And so introverts are perceived, probably most often by extroverts actually, as lacking self-confidence. But this is sort of a misconception, in my opinion, because it's not self-confidence that introverts lack. With that internal libido and that energy that's focused inwardly, that process of building who they are first, this is the introverted process, is to know themselves and to discover their passions and their interests and their philosophies and their worldview before they take that out and manifest it in some sort of an expression in the outside world. In my experience, introverts don't lack self-confidence. They often feel a great deal of inner conviction about what they do or who they are, but suddenly when confronted with the idea that they have to bring that out into the world, they are fearful that it's not going to be understood, recognized, or valued, And extroverts, on the other hand, I think have an innate confidence about whatever they try their hand at or do in the outside world. There's just less of a concern about how they're going to look or how that's going to come off maybe initially, whereas introverts are reflecting and concerned on the front end, and it takes them time to express the inner confidence they feel in an outward fashion. But conversely, extroverts are going to have, again, that same issue of maybe they appear confident and like they know what they're doing and feel convicted in their decision making and so on. But what we don't always see is maybe the level of private insecurity that extroverts feel about how they're living their lives, or the questions that they have about the purpose of life, and the meaning of life, and some of these more reflective questions that introverts, maybe feel more comfortable entertaining earlier in their lives.
Right. The introvert develops confidence in those inner affairs that you discuss, and the extrovert may feel a little less settled in their inner life and confident in that respect, but they appear more confident outwardly. So again, everything is flipped between these two types, and the goal obviously is to be confident in both one's inner and one's outer life, and to have those two things match and square with each other.
Right. I've always sort of conceived of the introversion and extroversion dichotomy as like two sides of a window or a looking glass, and I've long been obsessed with the story of Alice Through the Looking Glass. To me, it's a similar predicament of Alice probably being the introvert, having these perceptions of life that she in her subjectivity knows and is familiar with, but kind of falling through the looking glass or going to the other side, things are looking totally different. Things that once looked one way in her mind now appear to be totally different, and it's that same concept between introverts and extroverts. And so it's not surprising that, say, extroverts may often agree or find a consensus or get on the same page with each other, and maybe introverts as well, because it's like being on two sides of a window or two sides of a looking glass.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's just being an introvert, it just gives you a very different perspective from what it is like to be an extrovert, and it's hard to really know that thoroughly if you didn't have the opportunity to be inside the opposite type's head, for instance. But I think that's why we value these stories of fiction, like Lainey mentioned, that sort of metaphorically demonstrate how difficult it can be, or how interesting it can be to look at things through someone else's eyes, if we
right.
could.
There's also the question of subjectivity and objectivity, which is in a way is sort of funny to discuss, because I believe that from generally as we talk, I think we talk in a way that biases or favors extroversion, as though we're all kind of existing in the same objective reality, and we talk about, well, when there's an individual concern, that's somebody's subjective concern or somebody's subjective preference, and then bias, and then there's this this objective reality. But I think that many introverts would probably say that from where they sit, where what looks to the extrovert like subjectivity is to the introvert objectivity, and so it's this reversal. And that's what I mean about falling through the looking glass, because from the vantage point of the introvert, their private or subjective or personal world really feels like objective reality, and for all we know it is objective reality, or who's to say it's not. But then maybe and then when they look outward at the extroverted world, that to them seems more subjective from that vantage point of an introvert.
Right, so these terms of subjective and objective are themselves in some respects subjective, depending on how we're using them, and what perspective we're looking at or looking through. So,
and talking about subjective and objective, we might as well also then, segue into this question of individual versus collective, because that's often used, those things are sometimes interchangeable or used synonymously. The individual subjective position, vis-a-vis the extroverted or the collective objective position.
Exactly. And I talk about that some in my book, My True Type, how we can in many respects associate the introvert with individuality and the extrovert with the collective. And the reason for that is because when we are looking outward, again, the outer world, the thing that everyone can see, the thing that everyone can agree upon, that's the domain of the extrovert in many respects. And it's the inner landscape that the introvert is oriented to and fascinated with. And so the introvert is often concerned with, for instance, the protection of individual liberties. Not that extroverts aren't, but it's particularly dear to the introvert, and to protect the diversity, for instance, the diversity of the individual and the inner life, and sort of the how sacred that is to the introvert. And it extends into their kind of their political views at times. And the extroverted perspective is more concerned with how do we make things work on a larger scale, or interpersonally, or on the level of the collective. And these two sides of individualism and collectivism are longtime topics of philosophers as well. Some philosophers defending the individual, like Kierkegaard, for instance, who said that subjectivity is life. It's the most important thing that there is. Whereas you have philosophers like Karl Marx, who are focused on how can we optimize the collective systems. And so this has been fascinating for me as an INTP, seeing this sort of marriage of typology with philosophy, because it's almost like the personality types, depending on what the type is, we project our inner we look at things through our inner lens, which causes us to have a certain type of philosophy. So,
and extroverts do as well, even though they may not necessarily be as conscious of it. I mean, introverts spending the time that they do, I think, asking questions about who they are and why they think the way they think and why they feel the things that they feel and where their personal perceptions come from, are naturally inclined to spend time asking themselves about their own personal biases and their own lenses. Extroverts, I'm sure, do also, but it seems maybe a little less intense, or a little less common, especially early in life. And so right, so they may be, extroverts may be more willing to go with what is collectively, or go with what is objectively either established, or that seems to be already by popular consensus agreed upon, and feel comfortable with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Introverts may be a little bit more stubborn and holding to their own, as Elaine can attest in spending time with me. Can attest to the introvert maybe being a little more stubborn or resistant to conforming to
right.
To extroverted practices or ideas, or
I feel like they're, angsty, introverted teenagers all go through that phase of, scowling at, the popular kids in school as all being conformists and sheep, and, not ever stopping and questioning what they do or why they do the things they do. And, there may be some truth to that, but of course a lot of that is just the kind of outcryings of a introvert trying to find who they are, or why they feel so different, early in life in that growth phase.
I think there's a stronger tendency for the introvert to want to differentiate themselves
Yes.
from the outside world. I mean, they are already inclined to see themselves as different, but
Yeah.
that adolescent period and maybe in their early 20s and 30s, it's an act of trying to make the lines a little bit brighter as to who they are with respect to the out, kind of actually not with really respect to, but irrespective, apart from the outside world. So it's, sketching out that, filling in the details of the identity that they feel like they need to do in order to move forward with confidence, and knowing that they're going to be staying true to who they are inwardly. Whereas the extrovert is apt to be a little bit more willing to sort of look without and see what's happening without, what are other people doing, and
they might like to try that also, and to experience that also before they, and then they'll know more so probably for extroverted sensors, know by the act of doing, what feels at the end of the day feels more authentic and right to them than what doesn't. But they all have to kind of try on various actions or various philosophies, if you're an ENP versus an ESP,
right.
before you start to see kind of a pattern develop that speaks individually to who you are, you the extrovert, who you individually are.
Right. Sometimes I've said that for the introvert, reflection precedes action, whereas for the extrovert, action may, in many cases, precede reflection. Now, as Elaine clarified, that what I just said is most true for IN types, the introverted intuitive types, needing to reflect prior to action, and for the extroverted sensing type is going to tend to act prior to reflection, and the reflection comes later.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit, let's not conflate, the unwillingness to conform. So that's not just an introversion and extroversion dichotomy. That's also probably on some level an intuitive versus sensing dichotomy. I mean, there aren't any shortages of IS types who, don't want to stick out or be too individualist or too, think too.
The ISTP who wants to be a part of the fraternity or the football team, like, anyone else, or exactly.
And there are, plenty of EN types, especially that relish, being idiosyncratic and non-conventional. Perhaps many, if not all of them, do that. But with respect to the introversion and extroversion dichotomy, the question is the degree to which maybe there is a lot of forethought, especially in the first half of life, or self-reflection before trying to engage in something more extensively, whether it's a new idea or philosophy or a new activity in their lives.
The last thing that I think we should mention about introverts and extroverts is, which we touched on some in the prior podcast, is that all of the introverted types lead with an introverted dominant function, whereas all of the extroverted types will lead with an extroverted dominant function. And where this can sometimes trip people up, especially introverts, is that for introverted types who have a dominant inner judging function, such as introverted thinking or introverted feeling, these are actually classified by Myers-Briggs as perceiving types, as P types. So IFPs and IFPs and ITPs. Whereas for introverted, for IJ types, they actually lead with an inner perceiving function, like introverted intuition or introverted sensing. Now, this can really trip up introverted individuals, because they get confused about whether they're J or P types, because of this strange labeling system of calling, IJs who have an inner perceiving function as judging types, and vice versa for IPs. And so that's why we've created the type clarifier tests online on Personality Junkie that help individuals really know whether they're truly an INFP or an INFJ, or an INTJ or an INTP. And I also get into that issue in My True Type as well. But I think we're also going to save that for another podcast. It's kind of a confusing topic, but I just wanted to kind of introduce it here because it is a point of confusion.
And it's pertinent to the introversion extroversion discussion
that we're having, because it all leads back to what is the dominant function of the type, and that's really a critical thing to know.
So thanks so much, guys, for joining us on our second podcast. We are very much appreciating your feedback, your comments, questions. So send those to us. It helps us know where to go and what sort of topics to touch on in future podcasts. And we are also inviting you to send us questions that you would like answered for a recurring segment on the podcast that we're hoping to start doing in the near future. So if you can
just email aj@personalityjunkie.com.
Yeah, and we'll look forward to hopefully answering some of those questions in the future podcasts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoyed this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so in several ways. In addition to purchasing our books and personality tests, you can contribute through the support page on Personality Junkie. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution, you can do so through our Patreon page, which we link to in the footer of our website. Patreon supporters can enjoy a variety of benefits, such as access to unpublished material, complimentary copies of our upcoming books, as well as input on post and podcast topics. Your contributions make it possible for us to continue to provide quality posts and podcasts. Thank you for your support.